There was once a man whose mother knew he would die young. She knew it long before he took his first step. The goddess Thetis held the newborn in her arms and already knew the exact number of years he would live. The boy grew. Then he heard the prophecy a second time, this time as an adult warrior. "Stay home, live to see gray hair, and your name will fade from human memory. Go to Troy, die young, and they will speak of you for 3,000 years." He boarded the ship. This story is called The Choice of Achilles. The Greeks retold it for many centuries. When Alexander of Macedon prepared his campaign against the Persian Empire, he climbed a burial mound in the Troad. He placed a golden wreath on the stone. He called the fallen man fortunate. Today, archaeologists find Mycenaean spear points in that same layer of earth, broken bronze armor, the bones of warriors from the 12th century before our era. And the central thing, we still do not understand. Why does a rational person knowingly choose death? What did the Greek hear in the word glory that we no longer hear today? And would we agree to the same exchange? The Greeks found a name for what he chose: kleos. The sound of a name passed from mouth to mouth across generations, the only form of immortality available to a mortal. That night beneath Troy, Achilles did not yet know its name, but he had already chosen it. The shore of Thessaly. The cliffs of the Pelian Mountains drop directly into the water. One of the strangest stories in the entire Greek tradition begins in this place. Not with a war, not with a hero, with a wedding. Archaeologists find Mycenaean pottery from the 12th century before our era in this region, and broken bronze spearheads. What happened on this shore 30 years before the Trojan War is something we know from sources written much later. Apollodorus, Ovid, Statius. Each one added his own version. On the main points, they do not disagree. A man used to come here at night, the king of a small state called Phthia, a veteran of the voyage of the Argonauts, a friend of Heracles. His name was Peleus. And here, every night, a goddess used to emerge from the sea, the daughter of the sea titan Nereus, the youngest of 50 sea nymphs. Every sailor in the Aegean knew her name: Thetis. The question to which the ancient tradition does not answer at once: why was a sea goddess being given to a mortal king of a small mountain state? The answer was kept on the distant peaks of the Caucasus. There, chained to a cliff, hung the titan Prometheus, punished by Zeus for stealing fire for humans. An eagle tore at his liver every day. The liver grew back every night. In the eyes of the titan, blind from suffering, there remained something no Olympian possessed: knowledge of the future. Prometheus spoke one sentence: "The son of Thetis will be stronger than his father." That was enough. Zeus withdrew. Poseidon withdrew. That night, not a single divine hand touched her sea. The gods gave Thetis to the one whose son would never threaten Olympus: a mortal. The goddess knew, and she did not agree. Peleus waited for her on the shore for many nights, armed only with a rope woven by the centaur Chiron. One night, she finally walked out of the water. Peleus threw the rope. What follows is one of the strangest scenes in Greek mythology. Thetis turned into flame. A pillar of fire roared down onto the sand. Peleus did not let go. Her body became a lion. The roar of the lion traveled along the night shore. He did not let go. She became black seawater. He held the water in his arms. She became a column of fire. He held the fire. When Thetis took back her form as a goddess, Peleus was still holding her. This is how marriages were arranged in Old Greece, by the force of fate, not by the force of desire. The wedding took place on Mount Pelion, in the cave of the centaur Chiron. All 12 Olympian gods came. The Muses sang beside a mountain spring. Chiron brought his gift, an ash spear shaft polished to a shine, unbreakable. The same spear that, 30 years later, would kill heroes beneath the walls of Troy. 40 tables stood at the feast. Wine was poured from Cretan amphorae. Torchlight played on the bronze shields of the guests. The smell of roasted meat mingled with the smell of mountain herbs. And then, through the entrance, walked the one who had not been invited, the goddess Eris. Her name in Greek means strife. In her hand, she carried a small, golden apple, perfectly round. On its gleaming side, one word had been carved in Greek letters: "To the fairest." Eris placed the fruit in the middle of the table, walked out. The doors closed behind her on their own. 3 goddesses rose immediately: Hera, the wife of Zeus; Athena, goddess of wisdom; Aphrodite, goddess of love. Each one reached for the apple. The argument did not end at the table. It became a trial. The judge was a young Trojan shepherd named Paris. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. Aphrodite promised him as a reward the most beautiful woman on earth. Her name was Helen, Queen of Sparta. 10 years after that wedding, a fleet of more than 1,000 Greek ships would arrive at the shores of Troy. Achilles' war began on the day his parents sat down at their wedding table. He was born a year later. A boy with the blood of 2 worlds in his veins. The mortal blood of his father, the immortal blood of his mother. Thetis held the infant in her arms and looked into his face. Small, red, wrinkled, the ordinary face of a human child. She knew what neither Peleus, nor the servants, nor the nurse beside the cradle knew. Her son was mortal, because her husband was mortal. And this simple biological truth tore her heart more sharply than any prophecy of the gods. And here begins one of the most famous legends in all of world culture, even though Homer himself does not mention it. In the early Greek tradition, Achilles is simply mortal. The story of the bathing in the Styx appears much later. Its first surviving full description we owe to the Roman poet Statius, who lived more than 1,000 years after the hypothetical events of the Trojan War. But it is his version that became canonical. According to Statius, Thetis decided to deceive her own nature. She waited for night. She lifted the child from the cradle. She walked down a steep stone path to the underground mouth where the sea met the river of the dead, the Styx. Black water, across which Chiron ferried souls of the dead into the kingdom of Hades. Its current was not a river in the usual sense. Its surface scorched bodies into immortality. No mortal could endure its touch. Only a god. Thetis dipped her son into the water. She held him by the heel so the current would not take him. The water hissed where it touched his skin. The infant's body began to harden, like the body of a god. The tips of his fingers were touched by a cold from which one does not die. His heart beat once and did not stop. The Styx did its work, except for one tiny patch of his body that the water did not touch. The heel. The very heel by which Thetis had been holding him. 30 years later, by this late version, an arrow from Paris would find exactly that spot. But the goddess did not yet know this. She carried home a son who, as it seemed to her, had become invulnerable. The child slept on her arms. The last drops of black water dried on his skin. she was wrong. And Prometheus, chained on the Caucasus, saw it all. In his eyes, blind from suffering, an image of the future stood still. A young man with fair hair. The Greeks would one day call him Achilles, the fastest, the most beautiful, the most terrible, and the shortest lived. Phthia, a small state in northern Greece, squeezed between the Othrys Ridge and the sea. Today, nothing remains of the palace of Peleus. Everything we know about Achilles' childhood comes to us from later sources. Homer writes about him sparingly. The rest was filled in by poets who lived 500, 1,000, and 1,500 years after the hypothetical events. And here begins one of the strangest puzzles in the whole story. We do not know how Achilles lived his first years, the first great gap in his biography, the period between his birth and the age of 7. In Homer, it simply does not exist. In post-Homeric authors, the versions differ from one another so much that one thing is obvious. No one knew the truth. They were all inventing. In one variant, Thetis disappeared from the palace when Achilles was 2 or 3 years old. In Hesiod, she returned to the sea because she could not live among mortals. In Apollodorus, Peleus caught her at night beside the hearth. The goddess was holding the infant above the flame and trying the final method of making her son immortal. The Styx had not worked. Fire remained. An incantation by which the mortal element was to be burned out of the child's body. Peleus screamed. The incantation broke. Thetis vanished. Achilles would not see her again until the moment he turned 20 and was preparing to sail for Troy. The boy was left without a mother. The king of Phthia could not allow his son to grow up like an ordinary prince. He mounted a horse and rode north, to Mount Pelion. The Greeks considered this mountain the strangest place in all of Greece. On its slopes grew herbs found nowhere else in the Mediterranean. In its caves lived creatures an ordinary person never encountered anywhere else. And here lived the one with whom the greatest heroes of the Hellenic world had studied, the centaur Chiron. One detail must be made clear here. The Greeks imagined centaurs as a wild, coarse, drunken, warlike race. Chiron did not belong to them. His father was not an ordinary centaur, but the titan Cronus himself. This made Chiron older than the Olympian gods, and one of those primordial beings from whom Zeus and Poseidon themselves descended. Chiron knew the languages of animals. He could distinguish hundreds of healing herbs. He composed verses. He played the lyre. He healed broken bones, poisons, and wounds before which the priests of his time gave up. To this centaur, Peleus brought his son. The child was 7 years old. What exactly happened in Chiron's cave over 12 years, ancient authors described in different ways. But on one thing they agree. This was not the upbringing of a prince. This was the upbringing of someone else. Someone who is born once in a generation and is prepared for a single, specific task. It resembles what, centuries later among the Spartans, would be called a goge. Chiron fed Achilles the marrow of lions, the livers of boars, and the hearts of stags. A sacrificial diet. What in the ancient world was considered the food of gods and kings. The Greeks believed that, along with the flesh of an animal, its quality passed into the person eating it. The lion gave endurance. The boar gave ferocity. The stag gave speed. Modern research allows us to suggest that a diet high in animal protein during childhood does indeed affect physical development. The Greeks did not know this scientifically, but they guessed it intuitively. Boys who were fed the way Achilles was fed grew up physically stronger than their peers. The effect was visible by adolescence. Among the accounts of ancient authors, the image survives of Achilles the child catching a deer without a weapon. As a boy, he had already killed his first wild boar. By the age of 12 or 14, he had no equal among the centaur's students in wrestling, and he shot a bow so well that Chiron himself would set down the instrument and watch. All of this is fixed by ancient tradition, but there is something it does not explain. Achilles did not learn this, it simply came easily to him. What makes some people supernaturally gifted from birth? Modern science explains it as a combination of genetics, environment, and early development. But the phenomenon of exceptional talent has still not been fully explained. Somewhere in those years of Achilles' training, another boy arrived at the mountain, a few years older, quiet, without particular talents. The ordinary son of the king of a neighboring small kingdom, whom his father had sent to a famous teacher. His name was Patroclus. The Greeks recorded their relationship using several different words. Homer says, philos. In the 18th book of the Iliad, Achilles 7 times calls Patroclus the dearest of all his companions. In classical Greek, philos meant a deep love or attachment, ranging from the friendly to the romantic. The word in itself is ambiguous, but Aeschylus, who lived 300 years after Homer, in the tragedy The Myrmidons, wrote about Achilles and Patroclus as lovers directly. A portion of modern classicists lean toward the interpretation of Aeschylus. A portion do not. Homer himself does not say it outright. Ancient readers debated little. For them, the type of relationship was obvious. Everything Achilles did over the next 12 years of his life had this one person at its center. And for now, they were children. They ran down the slopes of Pelion with bows. They slept in the same cave. They hunted together. They learned to play the lyre side by side. And at this very same time, 1,000 kilometers to the south, in the city of Sparta, another event was taking place, without which the story of Achilles would have no meaning. A guest had arrived at the house of the Spartan king Menelaus, a young Trojan prince, the same shepherd who had once, on Mount Ida, judged the 3 goddesses and given the golden apple to Aphrodite. Aphrodite had kept her promise. She had promised him the most beautiful woman on earth. The woman was waiting for him in Sparta. Menelaus received the guest by all the laws of hospitality. His wife, the Spartan queen, walked out of her chambers with a slender silver amphora and filled the guest's cup. The guest looked at her. Her name was Helen. What happened next, each ancient culture described in its own way. Helen either fled with the Trojan prince on her own or was carried off by him. Homer, if you read his text closely, keeps both versions in tension and gives no final answer. A few months later, the most beautiful woman in the Mediterranean was no longer in Sparta. Menelaus sent messengers to his brother. The brother was called Agamemnon. He was king of Mycenae, the strongest state in Greece at that time. The messengers rode to all the Greek city-states. Long ago, before Helen's wedding, all the Greek suitors had sworn an oath to her. If anyone ever carried her off, they would become one army and bring her back. Now the oath was calling them to arms. And on Mount Pelion, at this very moment, Chiron led the 14-year-old Achilles to the summit. The night sky of northern Greece stretched above them, without city lights, without smoke, without dust. Chiron raised his hand and pointed at the constellations. He was speaking of fate. The Greeks did not imagine fate the way we imagine it. For them, fate was not punishment and not reward. Fate was a simple list of what would happen to you: calm, exact, written down somewhere before you were born. It could be known in advance. It could not be changed. And it was then that Chiron first told Achilles the truth. First, about his mother. Second, about the date of his own death. The boy listened in silence. Above Pelion, the stars of the constellation Heracles burned. A former student of this very same centaur, the first of those who had chosen the short road. Chiron gave no advice. He did not warn. He did not persuade. He simply said what he knew. And after that, Achilles would have to decide for himself how to live with this. The boy walked down from the mountain in the morning. 12 years of training were nearing their end. Soon he would have to return to his father, to Phthia, to the life of a prince. On the Pelion path, he stopped. For the first time, the centaur Chiron did not walk beside him. Phthia, the palace of King Peleus. The 19-year-old Achilles had returned from Mount Pelion. In different versions of the myth, his age on Skyros varies, but most late authors present him as a young man who had already completed his training with Chiron. 12 years of training were behind him. In the city, he was no longer a prince's son who had gone off to study. He was the one his father was preparing in his own place. Peleus was already past 40. He knew he would soon hand over power. He knew something else, too. War was coming to Phthia on its own. The messengers of Menelaus had ridden into the palace 2 weeks earlier. The Spartan queen, Helen, had left with a Trojan guest. The brother of Menelaus, king of Mycenae, Agamemnon, was calling together all the suitors who had once sworn an oath to Helen. Among those suitors was Achilles' father. Peleus had once stood in Sparta and sworn the same oath. Now the oath was coming for its payment. And when a woman whom Achilles had not seen for 19 years appeared in the palace that week, he understood for the first time that Greek fate is not a metaphor. It is an organized operation. Thetis came into her son without warning. Apollodorus writes that this happened at night. Statius says by day. In any case, she came from the sea and knew exactly how much time was left. The goddess saw what mortals did not see. She saw Achilles boarding Agamemnon's ship. She saw him not returning. And Thetis decided to do what no mother in Greek mythology had dared to do with a son before her: to hide him. Not behind a mountain, not in a temple, not under a false name in a distant city. Among women. The island of Skyros, a small, rocky, unremarkable patch of land in the Aegean Sea. The king of the island, Lycomedes, had 7 daughters. He was a distant relative of Thetis on the sea line of her family. He could be trusted. Thetis brought her son to Skyros herself, in women's clothing. Achilles was 19. By the standards of that era, he was already a fully formed man of fighting age, strong, broad-shouldered, conspicuous among his peers. To hide such a person among young girls seemed impossible. Thetis managed it. Exactly how, the sources differ. In Statius, she altered her son's voice through magic. In Apollodorus, she simply persuaded him to play the role. In most versions, Achilles wore his hair long, which at the time was not uncommon. But his youth helped the disguise. The 19-year-old Achilles could still be beardless. That is what helped him pass for a young woman. In all versions, he was given a female name, Pyrrha. In Greek, it means fire red, a hint at the color of his hair. This is what the scene looked like from inside the palace of Lycomedes. 7 daughters of the king. In the morning, they wove in the courtyard. By day, they studied music. In the evening, they walked out with their mother to pray to Artemis. Among them moved an 8th, tall, silent. with wide shoulders that the woman's dress could not hide. The daughters of Lycomedes knew the truth at once. According to most versions, the eldest, Didamia, found out on the very first night. She received the young man in the sister's bedchamber. In most ancient versions, a relationship between them began at once. 9 months later, Didamia bore Achilles a son. The boy was named Neoptolemus. 20 years later, this boy would walk into burning Troy with his father's sword. For now, he had only just been born. And Achilles, who was now Pyrrha, walked out into the courtyard with his daughter-sister and did the same things the other young women did. He wove, he washed linen, he carried water from the spring, he learned women's songs. On the outside, an ordinary young woman from the palace. On the inside, the best warrior of his generation, waiting for the world to forget him. Now the most interesting part. At Aulis, where the Greek fleet was assembling, Agamemnon could not move from the spot. 1,000 ships stood at anchor. Tens of thousands of warriors waited on the shore for the order to sail. The priests kept telling Agamemnon one and the same thing. If you sail without the son of Thetis, you will never take Troy. The war without him is impossible. Agamemnon called together his best men. Among them was a man who would enter history as one of the most cunning figures in the entire Greek tradition. King of the small rocky island of Ithaca, a little over 30 years old, reluctant to go to this war, leaving behind his wife Penelope and an infant son, Telemachus. Odysseus. To him, Agamemnon gave the task of finding Achilles. Odysseus knew that Thetis had hidden her son. He did not know exactly where. He did what no Greek before him had done. He went through all the small islands of the Aegean with a merchant caravan, passing himself off as a trader. He exchanged cloth for oil, bronze for wine, pottery for jewelry. He saw hundreds of women's quarters. On Skyros, he stopped at the palace of Lycomedes. What Odysseus did next went into all the textbooks of classical rhetoric as a perfect example of a logical trap. He laid out his wares before the daughters of Lycomedes: fine cloths, silver bracelets, combs of ivory, necklaces of Egyptian glass. And among all of this, he placed one thing that should not have been carried by a merchant: a bronze sword and an ash spear. 6 daughters of Lycomedes were sorting through the cloths and ornaments. The 7th touched a comb. The 8th, Pyrrha, was not looking at women's things at all. Her hand landed on its own on the hilt of the sword. Odysseus watched. He did not say a single word. He simply waited. And then he did a second thing. He ordered his men to blow on horns the signal of a battle alarm, the Greek war cry, which every warrior recognized from the first sound. 6 daughters of Lycomedes were frightened and ran deeper into the palace. The 7th screamed. The 8th tore off her dress, lifted the sword, took a fighting stance. Odysseus walked up to him and laid a hand on his shoulder. He did not say, "I have recognized you." He said one sentence: "Get ready. Greece is waiting for you." Achilles was 19. He had a choice. He could put the sword back in the ground. He could say no to Odysseus. He could remain on the island with Didamia and his son, live to 70, die in his own bed. Everything Thetis did had brought him to this moment, the moment in which he had the chance to choose otherwise. He chose the sword. Why? Ancient authors put this question for 25 centuries and did not give a single answer. Homer speaks of honor, Plato of the pursuit of glory, Sophocles of loyalty to comrades. Some modern interpretations link his pursuit of glory to the early loss of his mother. Thetis disappeared from his life when Achilles was 2 years old. He spent 12 years with a centaur, not with his own blood. And now, when his mother had appeared and asked him to hide once more, he could, for the first time, say no to her. He said no through a sword. Odysseus's ship sailed out of Skyros the next morning. Didymia stood on the cliff with the infant Neoptolemus in her arms and watched the sail vanish over the horizon. She already knew she would not see her husband again. Achilles, standing on the deck, was, for the first time in a year, wearing men's clothing. In bronze greaves, with the ash spear of Chiron in his hand. The ship was heading for Aulis, to join the other 1,000. And in Aulis, on that same shore, Agamemnon was doing something at that very moment that would have made Achilles turn the ship back had he learned of it in time. The king of Mycenae was sacrificing his daughter. Her name was Iphigenia. Aulis, a narrow bay on the coast of Boeotia. Today, archaeologists find here the remains of a temple of Artemis from the 9th century before our era and stone anchors used by Mycenaean ships. What happened in this bay between 1,000 ships and the altar of the goddess was described by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, each in his own way, each cruelly. 1,000 ships stood on the water and did not move. The ships were of different sizes. The largest, the 50-oared Mycenaean ships of Agamemnon. The smallest, fishing galleys from the lesser city-states. Tens of thousands of warriors sat on the shores and waited for the order. Some had been waiting for 6 weeks already. There was no wind, none at all. The sea froze still like oil. Not a single flag stirred. Not a single sail filled. The priests raised their palms to the sky and felt not even a warm breath. The Greeks understood long ago that this was not a natural occurrence. Altars burned on every promontory of the coast. They burned oxen, sheep, doves. They poured wine, honey, olive oil. Nothing changed. Artemis was silent, and Agamemnon knew why. A few weeks earlier, while hunting in a sacred grove, he had killed a deer. An ordinary deer, a trifle, it would seem, but the deer turned out to be one sacred to Artemis. The king of Mycenae had broken one of the oldest taboos of Greek religion. He had spilled the blood of an animal that belonged to the goddess on her own territory. The goddess took her revenge. Not with lightning, not with an epidemic, with a quiet, inhuman punishment. She took the wind. Tens of thousands of warriors could not sail. 1,000 ships rotted by the shore. Food supplies were running low. The first mutinies began in the army. Commanders of other Greek kingdoms came every day to Agamemnon's tent and demanded an answer. When are we sailing? The seer Calchas came to him on the 42nd day. Calchas was the chief seer of the Greek army. The Greeks believed him because he had earlier predicted the fall of Troy through 10 years of war. This man did not make mistakes in his prophecies. He brought the answer of Artemis. The goddess would agree to return the wind on one condition. Agamemnon must offer up his own daughter as a sacrifice. The oldest, the most beloved, 12-year-old Iphigenia. The king of Mycenae sat in the tent and looked at the seer. Calchas stood opposite him and waited for the answer. Between them, an oil lamp burned. In none of the ancient sources is it written what Agamemnon said in that moment out loud. But all sources agree on what he said next. Yes. Here, it is worth understanding what this meant. Greek culture was not a culture of human sacrifice. At the level of normal social practice, the Greeks did not place children on altars. They differed in this from some neighboring cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. In Carthage and Tyre, archaeologists find mass burials of infants with traces of ritual cremation, although the interpretation of these finds is still debated in scholarship. Isolated traces of human sacrifice survive in Greek memory as well, mostly in mythological plots and in moments of crisis. But as a regular practice in the time of the hypothetical Trojan War, they no longer existed. So what Agamemnon did transformed him from a king into a man whom his own family would never forgive. And he knew this when he agreed. Iphigenia was in Mycenae, 300 kilometers from Aulis. The king wrote a letter to his wife. His wife's name was Clytemnestra. In the letter, he wrote that he wanted to marry off Iphigenia to a young hero who was becoming the army's rising star, a famous warrior, a promising suitor, the future king of Phthia, Achilles. This was how Achilles first appeared in history, before doing anything in the war itself, as a name in a false wedding invitation. He did not know about it. Clytemnestra brought their daughter to Aulis 2 weeks later. The 12-year-old Iphigenia arrived in a wedding dress, white cloth, a silver belt, flowers in her hair. She thought she was going to meet her bridegroom. She was led to the altar. Here, the sources diverge a second time. Homer does not write about this scene at all. In his text, Iphigenia remains alive. Aeschylus writes that just before the knife came down, the girl was gagged so she could not curse her father. Euripides softens the scene. In his version, Artemis at the last moment substitutes a deer for the daughter and takes her to herself. The oldest of the tragedies, the version of Aeschylus, presents the death of Iphigenia itself. The later tradition often rescues her through the intervention of Artemis. Iphigenia was killed. Artemis returned the wind in the same hour. 1,000 ships sailed out of Aulis. Now about Achilles. He was in the army, but not in the command tent. At 19, he was not yet a general, but the young king of small Phthia, who had brought with him 50 ships and about 2,500 Myrmidon warriors. Disciplined, fanatically loyal, with a single order: to obey only him. When Achilles learned that Agamemnon had used his name to lure Iphigenia to Aulis, the conflict between these two men flared for the first time. By some versions, Achilles even offered Agamemnon single combat. The king of Mycenae refused. 10 years later, this conflict would be the cause of tens of thousands of deaths beneath the walls of Troy. For now, Achilles kept silent. He returned to his Myrmidons. He did not tell them what he had felt. Ancient authors record one thing. For the next 10 years, he did not once speak to Agamemnon personally, if he could avoid it. The fleet sailed out into the open sea. The crossing from Aulis to the Trojan coast took about 2 weeks. Along the way, the Greeks made stops on islands. They replenished water, repaired damaged ships, buried those who died of illness during the voyage. At one of these stops, something happened to Achilles' ship that Homer skips over, but Apollodorus describes in detail. The island of Tenedos, a small one, right in front of Troy. The king of the island, Tennis, was a son of Apollo. The Greek ships pulled up to the shore to take on supplies. Tennis came out to meet them with weapons in hand. He knew it was a military fleet and would not let the Greeks into his harbor. Achilles stepped onto the shore first. He killed Tennis with his ash spear. This was his first death on this war. Thetis, who saw everything from the sea, appeared to her son that same night. the last time before the war. She reminded him of the prophecy Chiron had spoken on Pelion. The 14-year-old Achilles had forgotten it. The 20-year-old Achilles understood for the first time that his mother had been speaking of something real. Do not kill the son of Apollo, because the son of Apollo who dies by your hand will curse you, and this curse will kill you before the arrow that is destined for you. Achilles had already killed Tennis. The curse had begun. Thetis stepped out of the tent. She would not appear by her son's side again until the day on which he had 48 hours left to live. Then she would come a second time. And for now, the fleet moved on. On the horizon, the walls of Troy appeared. The very same walls that, thousands of years later, the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann would dig up in a provincial Turkish village called Hisarlik. 7 layers of building. The 7th layer is dated to the end of the 13th and the beginning of the 12th centuries before our era. On it have been found traces of a fire that destroyed the city. Most modern researchers connect this layer to the Troy around which the Homeric tradition formed. The Greeks landed on the shore at dawn. The war that Prometheus had seen 30 years earlier in the cliffs of the Caucasus had finally begun. The 10 years it would take to capture this city, Achilles would not live to see. He had known this since the 14th year of his life, and still, he jumped off the ship first. Most people who know something about the Trojan War are certain. The Iliad tells the whole story of the siege. This is the most widespread mistake in popular culture. The Iliad tells 51 days out of 10 years. 10 years. 51 days in the text. The rest is a blank page that Homer did not see fit to fill in. What happened during those 9 years and 10 months we gather from fragments of other ancient poems. The Cypria, the Aethiopis, the Little Iliad. Most of these texts have been lost. Only the summaries of Byzantine commentators and short quotations in later authors have reached us. And it is precisely this lost material that reveals one thing. Achilles, beneath Troy, was not fighting the Trojans. He was fighting everyone else. Here, it is necessary to explain what this war really looked like. The siege of Troy was not a continuous 10-year assault on walls. The Greeks did not have the means to take a city with walls 4 meters thick. Hisarlik still impresses archaeologists. Mycenaean siege techniques could not destroy such fortifications. So the strategy was different. The Greeks settled on the coast, built a fortified camp out of a ditch and a wooden palisade, dragged their ships up onto the beach, and began to do what every army of that era did during a long siege. They laid waste to everything around them. The Trojan region, or the Troad, had dozens of small towns and villages. Lyrnessus, Pedasus, Tenedos, Skyros, Lesbos, Imbros. All of them were allies or tributaries of Troy. All of them supplied the city with grain, fish, metal, and cloth. If the Greeks could not take Troy directly, they had to cut it off from everything that kept the city alive. This work was done by Achilles. Homer mentions this in passing. In the 9th book of the Iliad, Achilles himself says that he captured 12 cities from the sea and 11 from the land. 23 cities in 9 years. That means, on average, 1 city every 4 months. City after city. Walls, smoke, bodies in the streets, prisoners, plunder. The ship returns to the camp on the coast beneath Troy. Achilles, at 20, 23, 25, was doing what today would be called total war against a civilian population. Statius writes about this more honestly than Homer. Lyrnessus, a city south of Troy. The king of Lyrnessus was Minos, an ally of Priam. The city held 2,500 inhabitants. Achilles sails in at dawn. The stone wall does not hold up under 3 hours of Myrmidon assault. Within 5 hours, there are no living men left in the city. Among the captive women, Achilles chooses one. Her name was Briseis, the daughter of Briseis of Lyrnessus. Her husband had been Minos, king of that same city. On the day Lyrnessus fell, her husband was killed on his own threshold. All 3 of her brothers died in the fighting on the walls. Her father, in some versions, hanged himself after learning of the city's fall. In a single day, she lost her entire family. And on the evening of that same day, Achilles took her into his tent as a trophy. In the ancient world, this was not something extraordinary. All Greek kings did this. All armies of that time did this. Women of the defeated were turned into slaves and concubines. This had been the norm of war for 3,000 years in a row. For the captive woman herself, in a world without the right of her own action, the status of a commander's concubine was the only available way to survive. Resistance meant death. Submission meant a chance at life. But Briseis. She was not an ordinary captive. In the 9th book of the Iliad, Achilles speaks of her in the way Greek men rarely spoke of women. She is his wife in everything but an official marriage. He plans to marry her after the war. He promises to take her home to Phthia. Homer gives one of the few scenes in the entire poem where a warrior and his captive live as husband and wife. How exactly the transformation happened. Between the evening when he took her as a trophy and the moment when he speaks of her as a wife, Homer does not explain. This is another gap. But it is exactly this gap that will become the center of the entire Iliad. Because one day, Agamemnon will take this woman for himself. For now, this is not yet in question. For now, the fleet stands on the coast. Smoke from burned villages rises on the horizon every week. Achilles, 23, Briseis beside him. Patroclus commanding the Myrmidons when Achilles is absent. Neither of them imagines that 9 years have already passed. In 2 weeks, an episode will begin which Homer describes in the 1st book of the Iliad. Before that, one more scene without which the story does not fit together. Achilles is 21 years old. His name is known not only in Greece, it is heard far beyond the Greek world. They have heard it in Troy, too. Priam sees how his allied cities are falling one after another. He understands by whose hand. And he does what any king in his place would do. He sends for help. Not south, not west. There are only Greeks there. He sends east, to Asia Minor, to the land of the Hittites, allied to Troy, to Lycia, to Cilicia, to the legendary land of the Amazons on the northern coast of the Black Sea, and to Ethiopia. Yes, to Ethiopia. Homer in the Odyssey mentions that the Ethiopians are allies of the gods and live on the very edge of the world. Ancient authors considered that the Greek world ended precisely there. From Ethiopia, beneath Troy, would arrive King Memnon, a dark-skinned giant in armor forged by Hephaestus himself. He would become one of those who almost killed Achilles. Almost. From the land of the Amazons would arrive Queen Penthesilea, a woman warrior with 800 horsewomen. She would become the second person with whom Achilles would meet in single combat. She would almost kill him too. Almost. Both of these opponents would appear in the 9th year of the war. Both would die by his hand. Both, after their deaths, would become more important to him than he himself would be able to understand. Penthesilea would die first. The duel with the Amazon is described in the lost poem The Aethiopus. A fragment has reached us. Achilles knocks her from her horse. The spear passes through her breastplate. The queen falls onto the sand. He walks up to finish her off, removes the helmet from her head. By the custom of the time, the victor took the helmet as a trophy. And he sees her face. In later ancient authors, who wrote hundreds of years after Homer, Achilles fell in love with Penthesilea in the second she was dying. Nearby stood a warrior named Thersites, a Greek soldier of low birth, known for the looseness of his tongue. He began to laugh at Achilles. He shouted that the great hero had gone soft over a dead woman, that his place was not on the battlefield, but in a skirt back on Skyros. Achilles turned and struck him with a fist to the face. Thersites died on the spot. This became one of the rare cases in which Achilles killed a Greek in all 10 years of the war. One of his own. Not in a duel, not in battle. Simply because the man had said the wrong word at the wrong moment. From beneath Penthesilea's helmet, a thin trickle of blood ran onto the sand. He stood over her and wept. This scene belongs to the later epic tradition, and detailed descriptions of it have reached us from authors writing hundreds of years after Homer. In the early versions, Achilles simply defeated the Amazon. The emotional unveiling of her face and the moment of pity entered the tradition much later. But it was precisely this later picture that became canonical for all subsequent generations. Everyone saw it. Tens of thousands of warriors of the Greek camp, thousands of horsemen of the Trojan army on the walls. The whole army, the fastest, the most beautiful, the most terrible, stood over the body of a woman he had just killed and could not walk away. In 2 days, Memnon would come out from beneath the walls of Troy. Behind him, someone more important still. But that is another story. For now, Achilles returns to his tent. In 10 days, Agamemnon will take Briseis away from him. From this moment, the Iliad will begin. And the end of Achilles will begin. The Greek camp beneath Troy. The 9th year of the war. Homer begins the Iliad with one word. In Greek, it stands first in the text. Menace. Wrath. Not deed, not valor, not war. Wrath. Sing, goddess, of the wrath of Achilles, son of Peleus. The first word of the most influential text of Western literature over the last 3,000 years is a word that describes not a positive trait. This is a question to which the ancient tradition for centuries gave no single answer. Why does Homer begin a poem about the most famous military campaign of antiquity with a description of a quarrel in the camp? The answer becomes clear only after you have read the whole poem. Because the Iliad is not an epic about valor. It is an epic about what happens when someone strong is offended. The episode from which everything begins looks like this. The Greek camp. The tent of Agamemnon. In the tent stands a priest of Apollo named Chryses, an old man in a white robe with a staff in his hand. He has come to ransom his daughter Chryseis, whom the Greeks had captured in one of their coastal raids and given as a trophy personally to Agamemnon. Chryses brought gold with him, a great deal of gold, enough to buy 40 such slave girls. Agamemnon drives him out of the tent. He does not simply refuse. He humiliates him publicly in front of all the commanders. He says that he will sooner return the daughter of Chryses when she has grown old and lost her beauty in his bed. That the priest may go and not return until his staff itself kills him from weariness. Chryses walked out of the camp and went down to the seashore. He raised his hands to the sky. He called on Apollo. The god heard him. Apollo came down from Olympus with his silver bow. He sat on a hill above the Greek camp, and he began to shoot. The arrows of this god did not kill from a wound. They carried plague within them. The first to die were dogs and mules, then people. The epidemic lasted 9 days. Each morning began with new funeral pyres. On the 10th day, Achilles called a general assembly of the army. He summoned the seer Calchas, the very same one who in Aulis had told Agamemnon about the necessity of sacrificing Iphigenia. Calchas was the only person who could determine why Apollo was angry. The seer was afraid to speak. Achilles swore that he would personally protect him from any revenge. Only then did Calchas tell the truth. Apollo is angry because Agamemnon refused his priest. The epidemic will end only when Chryseis is returned to her father without ransom. Agamemnon exploded. He accepted the ultimatum to return the girl. He could not do otherwise. The army was dying. But he set out his own condition. If I give up my woman, I will take another man's. To be precise, Achilles's. Briseis. Here, one needs to understand what this meant for Achilles. Briseis. This was not simply a woman he had lived with for 3 years. This was his military share, what belonged to him by right of the stronger in the system of Greek military honor. To take her away meant to say publicly, "You are not worth your share. You receive less than you have earned." This was an attack not on a woman. This was an attack on status. Achilles drew his sword right there in the command tent. Homer describes this moment in detail. Achilles slowly pulled the blade out of its sheath. In that second, in Homer's words, the goddess Athena appeared next to him, invisible to everyone else. She seized Achilles by the hair from behind and stopped the blow. Athena said 2 words to him. "Not now." Achilles slid the sword back. Most modern classicists read this scene as a metaphor for inner self-control. Ancient readers read it literally. In any case, Achilles did not kill Agamemnon that day. But he made one decision. He withdrew from the war. He did not return to Phthia. He did not board a ship. He stayed in the camp. But he declared that his Myrmidons were no longer entering battle. Not one of his 2,500 warriors would lift a spear for the Greeks until Briseis was returned. Achilles returned to his tent. He locked it from the inside. Briseis was taken away the next morning. Homer describes this scene with a tenderness rare for him. 2 of Agamemnon's heralds come to Achilles' tent. They are afraid. They know what could have happened to them. Achilles steps out of the tent, looks at them without anger, sees that they themselves are not to blame. He calls Patroclus. He says, "Lead her out. She has to go." Briseis walks out. Homer writes one line. The woman went with them, unwilling. That is all we know about her in that moment. She did not weep. She did not plead. She simply went, unwilling. Achilles walked out to the seashore. He sat on the sand. He called for his mother. Thetis came. For the first time in 9 years. The last time they had seen each other was on the island of Tenedos, when she had reminded him of the prophecy about the son of Apollo. Now she listened to her son, and she did what any mother would do who still believes she can save her child. She went to Zeus. Thetis fell at his feet and asked for one thing. Punish the Greeks. Make it so that without my son they begin to lose, so that they understand what they are worth without him, so that Agamemnon himself comes to him asking forgiveness. Zeus was silent for a long time. He knew what this would mean. Thousands of Greeks would die. Zeus nodded. From this moment in the Iliad begin 21 books of war without Achilles. 21 books in which the Trojans come out from the walls and beat the Greeks. 21 books in which the Greeks retreat, lose battles, lose ships. In a few days, the Trojans will break through the line of defense and approach the very ships of the Greek fleet. They will set the first ship on fire. If this fire spreads to other vessels, the Greeks will lose their only way home. They will be destroyed. In that moment, Agamemnon will understand how much he depends on the man he humiliated. He will send an embassy. The embassy will arrive at Achilles' tent by night. 3 men: old Phoenix, Achilles' tutor from his early childhood, who had come with him from Phthia; Ajax, the best Greek warrior after Achilles himself; and Odysseus, the same one who 9 years earlier had taken him from Skyros. They will enter the tent. Achilles will be sitting beside the fire and playing on a lyre, the same lyre on which Chiron had taught him to play in the cave on Pelion. Beside him, Patroclus will be sitting and listening. This is one of the strangest scenes in the Iliad. The commander of the Myrmidons plays on a lyre, while the entire Greek army is dying 500 meters from his tent. The embassy will bring Agamemnon's offer: 7 cities to rule, 20 bronze tripods, 12 horses from his stables, 7 women from Lesbos, Briseis, of whom Agamemnon swears he has not touched in all these days, and his own daughter as a wife when the war is over. Achilles will refuse it all. This is the moment in which, for the first time, he will say out loud the 2 versions of his fate. My mother Thetis told me that 2 fates carry me toward the day of my death. If I stay here and fight beneath the walls of Troy, my return home is impossible. But my glory will be eternal. If I sail home to my native land, my honor and my glory will die, but my life will be long, and death will not take me quickly. One of the most important monologues of ancient literature. The first case in the history of the Western tradition where a hero, out loud, clearly, and consciously chooses between a long life without meaning and a short life with meaning. Philosophers will quote these words for 25 centuries. Today, they are studied in ethics courses at the leading universities of the world. That night, in the tent beneath Troy, Achilles answered the embassy. I am sailing home. At dawn, I am taking the Myrmidons out of camp and sailing for Phthia. I will live to gray hair. I will die in my own bed. Glory does not interest me. And here it is worth pausing. This was not a change of the decision he had made on Skyros 9 years before. It was an attempt to outplay his own fate. Achilles had known his mother's prophecy since he was 14. He had chosen to disregard it when he had walked with Odysseus onto the ship. And now, after the insult from Agamemnon, for the first time out loud, he was trying to say no to the gods. He was trying to prove that his choice was still reversible, that the death promised him from childhood could still be cheated by an act of will. He himself did not believe what he was saying, but he had to say it. The embassy left. Achilles lay down beside Patroclus and fell asleep. And far away on Olympus, Zeus was already beginning the second stage of his plan, the one Thetis had not foreseen. Because Zeus knew what even the mother did not know. Achilles would not sail home. Tomorrow morning, there would be a new battle. In this battle, the Trojans would reach the very Greek ships. They would set the first one on fire. And Patroclus, the quiet companion of Achilles from the cave of Chiron, would walk into the tent and say one sentence: "Give me your armor. I will go in your place." What would happen next would turn Achilles' choice from an open one into a sealed one. The door to a long life would no longer exist. The morning of the next day began in the Greek camp without hope. Achilles sat in his tent. The Myrmidons had received the order to pack up. In 2 days, the ship of Phthia was to sail home. 25 centuries of classicists agree that this was not a bluff. Achilles really was withdrawing from the war. Homer gives no hint that this was theater. And 500 meters from his tent, the Greek army was dying. The Trojans, led by Hector, had broken through the line of defense at dawn. Archers from the city walls covered the line of retreat with arrows. Chariots came in from the flanks. By noon, the Greeks had lost 2,500 warriors. By evening, the front had been pushed back to the very ships on the shore. Homer describes this day in the 15th book. Hector set fire to the first ship personally, a torch in his hand, flame along the wooden hull, smoke over the whole camp. If even one ship burns, the others stand right against it. The fire will spread. The Greeks will lose the fleet. Without the fleet, they cannot return home. They will simply die on this shore. It was at this very moment that Patroclus walked into Achilles' tent. Homer describes his state in a single line. Tears ran down his cheeks, like dark water that drips from a high cliff. Patroclus had been watching the friends of his childhood die 500 meters away. He remembered their names. He knew their families. He could no longer look at it. He came to Achilles with one request. If you do not want to enter the battle, allow me to go in your place, in your armor, on your chariot, with your spear. The Trojans will be frightened seeing you on the field. This will give the Greeks time to push them back from the ships. Achilles refused at once. He knew one thing. The spear of Chiron, made from Pelian ash, would not let Patroclus survive real combat. Because only Achilles himself could use it. Its shaft was made exactly for his hand. But the flame along the side of the ship stood before his eyes. Achilles sat and looked at Patroclus, at his companion from the cave of Chiron, at the only person with whom he had shared his childhood, his youth, and this war. At the one whose grief he could not bear. He gave in. Homer shows how exactly this happened. Achilles rose and with his own hands fastened his armor onto Patroclus, the bronze breastplate with the relief of the sun, the greaves, the helmet with its horsehair crest, the shield with 8 layers of leather and bronze fittings, everything except for the spear. The spear of Chiron remained in the tent. In its place, Achilles gave his friend another spear, an ordinary one, of Myrmidon make, not the one that could kill any of the Trojan heroes. And he said one thing to Patroclus. Go, push the Trojans back from the ships, and come straight back. Do not go past the edge of our camp. Do not approach the city walls. Patroclus nodded. He led the column of Myrmidons out of the camp. 2,500 warriors in bronze armor. In front of them, a man in the armor of Achilles, on the chariot of Achilles. The Trojans saw, and they did exactly what Achilles had hoped. They stopped. Hector saw the familiar figure in the distance and gave the order to retreat to the walls. The forces of the Trojans began to fall back. The Greeks took advantage of the moment. They counterattacked. The fire on the ship was put out. The line of defense was restored. Everything could have ended here. If Patroclus had returned to camp, Achilles would have lived. The Iliad would have had no climax. Troy would have stood for more years. Patroclus did not return. He saw the Trojans retreating. He saw how easily they were running from him. He saw the field strewn with the Greek bodies of his friends, and he did what Achilles had forbidden him. He pursued them. Homer writes about this with bitterness. Fool, fool. If you had listened to Achilles, you would have come back alive. Patroclus chased the Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy. Beneath the city walls, Apollo himself was waiting for him. The god, who had hated the Greeks since the day Agamemnon had insulted his priest, came down to the battlefield invisible. He walked up to Patroclus from behind, struck him with his palm in the back. Homer describes this blow as a blow that took away strength, not a weapon, simply the touch of a god. Patroclus stood stunned. The helmet of Achilles fell from his head onto the sand. The spear fell from his hands. In that moment, a Trojan named Euphorbus saw him. A simple soldier, not a hero. He ran up from behind and struck Patroclus with a spear between the shoulder blades. Patroclus reeled, and in this very second, stunned, without a weapon, with blood on his back, Hector saw him. Hector walked up to him calmly. He understood that this was not Achilles. He understood who this really was. He raised his spear and struck Patroclus in the belly. Patroclus fell onto the sand. He lived for several more minutes. The last words he spoke to Hector went into every textbook of literature. "You will kill me, Hector, but your end too is near. Beside your body, Achilles will stand." Hector did not answer. He stripped the armor of Achilles from the dead Patroclus, put it on himself, turned the chariot, and rode back to the city. And the body of Patroclus lay between the two armies. For about 15 minutes, the Greeks and Trojans fought over it. Homer describes this battle in the 17th book. Ajax and Menelaus pulled the dead man out from under the fire. They carried him to camp. In Achilles' tent, Antilochus, son of King Nestor, the fastest of the army's messengers, brought the news. Homer describes the scene this way. Antilochus walked into the tent. He saw Achilles sitting and waiting for news. He could not speak. He simply wept. And then, in Homer's words, Achilles understood everything himself before they told him. He took a handful of black earth from the floor of the tent, poured it over his head. He tore his clothes. He screamed. Homer says that this scream was heard by Thetis, in the depths of the sea, many miles from the shore. A few hours later, a column of sea nymphs would emerge from the sea with the mother at the head. They would come to Achilles' tent, sit beside him, and 49 sisters of Thetis, all 50 Nereids, would weep together with her over the body of her son, who was still living. Because in this scene, Thetis pronounces her own verdict on him. She says to Achilles one thing. Homer cites the mother's words in the 19th book. "My son, if you now go out to avenge Patroclus, your death will become the nearest of all. Because so it is said in fate, Hector will die by your hand. And after Hector, death will come for you too." Achilles looked at his mother, and he said one thing, which classicists for 25 centuries considered the final point of his choice. "Then let me die at once. Because when my companion died, and I was not there to protect him, I no longer have the right to live." In that second, the choice that had remained open for 30 years, from the moment Chiron had told the 14-year-old Achilles about his two fates, was sealed. There were no longer two fates. There remained one. The next morning, Achilles went out onto the field, without the armor of Chiron. Hector had taken it. In new armor that, during the night, Hephaestus had forged for him at the request of Thetis. A bronze breastplate with an image of the entire Greek cosmos. A shield with 8 concentric circles on which all the life of humankind was depicted. Achilles went out alone, and in one day he killed everything Troy still had in the field. Homer describes this day in the 20th and 21st books. First, Achilles killed 19 Trojan heroes by name. Then hundreds of nameless warriors. Then he drove an entire army into the river Scamander. So many bodies floated in the river that the river itself overflowed its banks. The god of the river Scamander rose from the water and said to Achilles, "Stop. My river can no longer carry so much blood." Achilles did not stop. Scamander attacked him with waves. This is the only scene in all of ancient literature in which a mortal warrior fights a river god. Achilles got out of the water only because Hephaestus sent fire to the bank, which began to evaporate the river. By evening of that day, all the Trojans still living had fled into the city. The gates closed. Except for one. Hector remained beneath the walls. He knew why. Hector stood before the Scaean gate of Troy. Behind the walls of the city were his father, King Priam, his mother, Queen Hecuba, his wife Andromache, with their small son Astyanax in her arms. The king who had ruled for 30 years, the queen who had borne him 50 children, the woman he loved. All three stood on the wall and looked down. All three shouted to him the same thing. "Come inside the city." Hector did not come in. Homer explains why in the 22nd book. This was not valor. This was shame. Hector knew. If he came into the city and hid behind the walls, he would remain alive. But all those who had died that day beyond the walls had died because of his tactical mistakes. It was he who had kept the army in the field instead of pulling it back into the city earlier. Because of him, the Trojans had lost everything they had on the day of the slaughter by Achilles. Hector could not return defeated to his father and mother. He would live on after that. But he would live with what he saw in their eyes. He stayed before the gate. From the north, along the road from the river to the Scaean gate, Achilles was approaching. In his youth, Hector had been one of the fastest runners in Troy. When Achilles came within 200 meters, Hector saw his face and understood that they were not equal. He turned and ran. Homer describes a scene that in no way fits into the epic style. Two warriors ran around the walls of Troy 3 times, without fighting. One was fleeing, the other was chasing. Like 2 runners in a stadium, only without a judge and without a wreath for the victor. All the Trojans on the walls watched in silence. All the Greeks in the field watched in silence. Hundreds of thousands of eyes followed how their best warrior was running from someone else's best warrior. On the 4th circuit, Hector stopped. He turned to face Achilles. He knew there was no point in running farther, because Athena, the goddess of the Greeks, in human form had run up to him from one side and said that his brother Deiphobus, with reinforcements, was beside him. Hector believed her. He looked around. His brother was not there. Athena had deceived him so he would stop. Achilles drew near. Hector said one thing. "Let us make an agreement. Whoever wins will return the body of the loser to his family for burial." This was not weakness. This was custom. Any Greek warrior would have accepted such a condition. Achilles refused. Homer cites his words. "Between people and lions, there are no agreements. As wolves and lambs have no shared word, so you and I have no shared word." He accepted no terms. The fight lasted about 3 minutes. Hector threw his spear. The spear struck the shield of Hephaestus and bounced off. Achilles threw his. Hector dodged, but the spear stuck in the ground behind him. Athena, invisible, picked up the spear and returned it to Achilles' hand. Hector drew his sword. He charged forward. Achilles knew the weak place of his own armor, the armor he had once given Patroclus and that Hector now wore. the place where the helmet met the breastplate, the opening for the throat. The spear went in exactly there. Hector fell to his knees. He lived for another minute. His last words Homer recorded this way: "I see your fate in your eyes. You will not outlive me by long. Between the Scaean gate and the chariot of Paris, your death stands and waits." Achilles answered, "I will die when the gods say so, and you die now." Hector died. His last words were not a prophecy. The ancient authors understood this scene differently. The dying man, according to Greek belief, already stood with one foot in the world of spirits. He was voicing what the gods saw, what was already written in fate. Achilles had only a few days left. What Achilles did next, for 2,500 years, has made commentators uncomfortable. This is the moment when the Greeks themselves, in later tragedies, in philosophical works, criticized their own hero. Achilles pierced the tendons of Hector's heels. He passed a leather strap through them. He tied the body to his chariot, and he drove the horses around the walls of Troy. The body of Hector dragged in the dust. The head struck the stones of the road. On the walls of Troy stood Priam, Hecuba, and Andromache. The wife of Hector fell unconscious. The queen tore her hair. The old king Priam wept like a child. Achilles made 3 circuits. Then he dragged the body to the Greek camp, threw it down beneath his tent. In the dust, not in the tent, lying on the ground like the corpse of an animal. This happened in the 10th year of the war. Everything Achilles had done before this fit into the norms of that time: killings, raids, war. This did not fit. No Greek warrior before him had defiled the body of an enemy so publicly and for so long. Homer explains this through one thing. This was not revenge for Troy. This was something far more personal. In Achilles' tent, the body of Patroclus lay. The friend had not yet been buried. By Greek custom, the body had to stand for several days before burial, while family and friends said goodbye. Achilles came up to the body of Patroclus every night. He lay beside it on the ground. He did not eat. He did not drink wine. He did not sleep. Homer describes his state with medical precision rare for epic. He lost weight. His skin went gray. His eyes sank. For 48 hours, he dragged the body of Hector around the grave mound of Patroclus, each morning anew. The gods watched this from Olympus. Not the Trojans, the gods. Zeus himself intervened. He summoned Thetis to Olympus. He said to her directly, "Go to your son. Stop him. What he is doing to the body of Hector will not be forgiven, even by me. Not for Troy, not for the Greeks, for me." And to Troy, Zeus sent the goddess Iris with another errand. "Go to Priam. Tell him that tonight he will walk to the camp of the enemy, alone, without a guard, with one chariot and one driver. He will bring a ransom, and Achilles will give him the body." Priam heard the order of the gods. This is the strangest scene in the whole Iliad. The king of Troy, a man over 70, who has lost 49 sons in 10 years of war, walks out of the city at night, alone, through the Greek lines, to the tent of the man who killed his oldest and most beloved son. With him, only an old servant on the chariot. On the chariot, the ransom: 10 talents of gold, 12 cloaks, 24 woven coverlets, cauldrons, tripods, a cup of Phoenician silver. Everything Priam had of value in his treasury, all for the chance to bury his son. Hermes, messenger of the gods, led the old man through the Greek camp invisible. Not a single sentry stopped him. The chariot drew near the tent of Achilles. The old man went in alone. Achilles sat at his table. Beside him stood two warriors. He had just finished his supper. A figure in simple clothes entered, an old man with a white beard. He came in, knelt, took Achilles' knees in his arms, and did what Homer cannot record without stopping. Priam took Achilles' hands, the hands that killed his son, the hands that before that had killed 12 other sons of his in 10 years of war, and he kissed them. Achilles, equal to the gods. Remember your father. He too is old, like me. He too will one day wait for news of his son. You are his only one. I had 50 sons. Hector was the last one to defend me. You have taken him too. Give me back the body. Allow me to bury the only one I have left. Homer describes Achilles' reaction in a single line. He wept. Why Achilles wept? Homer does not explain. Classicists for 25 centuries have given different answers. For his own father, whom he would never see again. For Patroclus. For himself, the Achilles he had been before this day. For old Priam, who had done the impossible. For the entire war, which had brought these two men together in this tent. Probably for all of this together. Achilles lifted the old man from his knees. He sat him at the table. He himself served him supper. He offered him wine. Two men, the one who had started the war by his refusal to return a stolen woman, and the one who had been the swiftest hand of this war, sat at one table and ate. Then Achilles walked out of the tent. With his own hands he washed the body of Hector. With his own hands he anointed him with olive oil. With his own hands he wrapped him in the cloth that Priam had brought, and he gave him to the father. Priam drove back to Troy before dawn, with the body of his son on the chariot. Through the same sentries that had not seen him on his way in. Hermes again led the old man through the lines invisible. In the city, the burial of Hector began. For 9 days they gathered wood for the funeral pyre. On the 10th day, the body was burned. On the 11th, the bones were placed in a golden urn. On the 12th, they were buried in a mound beyond the walls of the city. On the 21st day, the truce was ending. The war resumed. And in the Greek camp, Achilles sat in his tent and waited. He knew that Hector had told him the truth before dying. Between the Scaean gate and the chariot of Paris, his death was already standing. He had 3 days left to live. The truce for the burial of Hector lasted 12 days. On the 13th morning, the Greeks and Trojans stood again on the battlefield. The Iliad ends here. Everything that came afterward, the death of Achilles, the wooden horse, the fall of Troy, Homer does not describe. It is the future to which the reader must come on his own. That is how the Iliad is built. A poem about the choice one man made. The poem breaks off when the choice is complete. The rest is described by other sources. The most detailed account of Achilles' death survives in the lost poem The Aethiopis, which has reached us only in the summary of the Byzantine patriarch Proclus from the 9th century of our era. Several fragments are in Apollodorus, Statius, Ovid. All of them agree on one thing. Between Hector's funeral pyre and Achilles' own death, about 2 weeks passed. The war managed to make one more turn in those 2 weeks. Here, it is worth recalling what happened in the earlier sections. After the death of Hector, Troy was left without its chief commander. King Priam called for allies from across the eastern Mediterranean. The first to arrive was the queen of the Amazons, Penthesilea. Achilles killed her a week later, in the very scene where he wept over her helmet. The second to arrive was the king of Ethiopia, Memnon, with an army of dark-skinned warriors in armor by Hephaestus. Memnon was the son of Eos, the goddess of dawn. He was nearly invincible. His armor, like that of Achilles himself, had been forged by Hephaestus. In the lost poem The Aethiopis, this duel is described as the climax of the entire war. Two warriors closed with each other in single combat. No god had the right to interfere. Zeus himself forbade it. The fight lasted a long time. Neither could overcome the other. And then, on Olympus, Zeus lifted the golden scales of fate. On one pan, he placed the fate of Achilles. On the other, the fate of Memnon. The pan with Memnon's fate sank down. In that very moment, the sword of Achilles passed through the chest of the Ethiopian king. Memnon fell. This was his last great victory. Hector, Penthesilea, Memnon. The three best warriors of this war. All three killed in 9 days. All three killed by the same man. He no longer stopped. Homer in the Odyssey writes that toward the end of his life, Achilles was driven by fate, like a ship without a rudder that runs onto the rocks and cannot turn aside. This was not valor. This was not heroism. This was something closer to what modern psychiatry would call a state without the possibility of stopping. He drove the Myrmidons up to the very walls of Troy every morning. On the 12th day after the burial of Hector, he walked up to the Scaean gate, no longer as a warrior taking part in a war, as a man seeking his own death, because nothing else remained. Paris stood on the wall. This is the name that had been repeating throughout the whole story from the very beginning. A young Trojan shepherd who judged 3 goddesses and carried off Helen. The man through whom this war had begun 30 years before. In battle, Paris was mediocre. He shot a bow, not badly. In close combat, he was weak. Most of the war he spent behind the walls and did not go out into the field. Now he stood on the wall with a bow in his hands. Beside him stood Apollo. All sources agree on this detail. The arrow was loosed by Paris, but it was guided by the god. The same Apollo who 30 years earlier had begun this story. Who had whispered to Prometheus the prophecy about Thetis, then decided that Achilles must die for killing his priest, then struck Patroclus in the back beneath these same walls. Apollo had been waiting for this moment a long time. He placed his hand on the hand of Paris. He drew the bowstring. He took aim. The arrow flew from the walls. Homer does not reach this scene. The further details came from Roman authors of the 1st century of our era. According to the version that became canonical, the arrow passed through the air and struck Achilles in the heel, in that very spot where the water of the Styx had once not touched him. In the early tradition, Achilles is simply a mortal warrior who fell from an arrow beneath the walls of Troy. The concept of invulnerability with a single weak point was fixed by later authors, but it was their version that reached us. 30 years before, Thetis had held an infant above a black river. Her fingers had left a dry spot on the tiny foot. The arrow of Paris found that spot. Achilles died on the spot. Not in a fight with the best warrior of Troy. Not in a duel with an equal. From the arrow of a man he despised. On the earth beneath the walls of the city, around every village of which he had over 10 years left ash and corpses. The fight over the body of Achilles lasted until evening. The Greeks fought for it as they had for no one else before. Ajax, the strongest warrior after Achilles, took the body on his shoulders and carried it out of the battle. Odysseus covered them. Arrows and spears flew from all sides. The body was brought into camp only at sunset. The funeral of Achilles is described by Homer in the 24th book of the Odyssey, through the mouth of Agamemnon himself, who, already dead, meets Achilles in Hades. The body burned on the funeral pyre for 17 days and nights. 17. The same number of days for which Achilles had mourned Patroclus. The Greeks understood the symbolism. Onto the pyre they threw the armor of Hephaestus, spears, the chariot, 12 Trojan youths taken prisoner specially for the sacrifice. This is a detail that modern classicists do not like, but ancient sources record. Among the Greeks, this was called fitting. The bones of Achilles were placed in a golden urn. The urn was sealed. And they did what Achilles himself had asked his mother on the island of Skyros before the war. On that night, when he had first learned of the two versions of his fate and had chosen the short one, he had asked to be buried together with Patroclus, not in separate graves, not in the family vault of Peleus in Phthia, not on the island with Deidamia and his son Neoptolemus, in one urn, with that boy from the cave of Chiron. The Greeks honored the request. The ashes of Patroclus, which had been waiting in Achilles' tent for 2 weeks, were joined with the ashes of Achilles himself. The urn was placed in a burial mound on a high hill above the Hellespont, on the very shore where the Greek fleet had landed 10 years before. The mound is visible from the sea for tens of kilometers. The burial was made so tall that sailors would see it from many days of voyage away. Both Greeks and Trojans, and the centuries to come, and the future warriors of empires not yet born. 1,000 years later, one man came to this mound. He was 22 years old. He was the young king of a small mountain country in northern Greece, Macedon. His father had just been killed, and he was preparing to begin the largest military campaign in the history of the ancient world, against the Persian Empire. Before the campaign, he made a stop. He crossed the Hellespont. He rode up to the mound. With him was his closest friend, Hephaestion. Alexander placed a wreath on the mound of Achilles. Hephaestion placed a wreath on the mound of Patroclus beside it. Everyone present understood the parallel at once. And Alexander spoke one sentence, which Arrian, the Roman historian of the 2nd century of our era, recorded in his book Anabasis of Alexander. "Fortunate are you, Achilles, that you had Homer to sing your glory." Alexander of Macedon always kept with him beneath his pillow a copy of the Iliad with his own notes. Plutarch records this. He knew the poem by heart. He compared himself to Achilles all of his conscious life. He too would die at almost the same age. At 32, of fever, far from home, in Babylon. It can be said that the second man who came to that mound as to his own destiny made the same choice, and died young, and became one of the most famous names in history. And the story of Achilles, meanwhile, kept on living. The Greeks retold it for 900 years without a break. The Romans translated the Iliad into Latin and studied it in all their schools. Byzantine scholars copied it by hand for 1,000 years. Arabic translators brought it to Spain in the 10th century. Italian humanists returned it to Europe in the 14th. Today, the Iliad is studied in schools in 140 countries of the world. Hector was right. You will not outlive me by long, Achilles. He did not outlive him. He died a few days after him. But they will speak of you. They are speaking. 3,000 years. In schools, universities, films, series, novels, operas, ballets, video games. In this documentary too. This is what Achilles chose in the tent beneath Troy, in the conversation with the embassy. He exchanged 70 years of life for 3,000 years of a name. Today we are sitting in the 21st century of our era. That means 32 centuries after Achilles died beside the Scaean Gate. And he is still here. In books, in school curricula, in the conversations of historians, in the consciousness of millions of people who do not even remember where they heard his name for the first time. The question with which we began, why does a rational person knowingly choose death? The Greeks answered this through the concept of kleos. Kleos in Greek does not simply mean glory. It is more specific. It is the sound of a name being passed from mouth to mouth through generations. The Greek believed that as long as your name is being spoken, you are not entirely dead. You live in this narrow band of sound that travels through time. For a person of that era, this was not a metaphor. It was the only available form of immortality. The gods had their own immortality, bodies that do not die, time that does not touch them. A mortal could have only kleos, the sound of a name. That is why Achilles chose what he chose. And here is another question, which it is worth honestly answering. Could we, today, make such a choice? Most modern people would say no. We live in a culture where a long life is valued more than a great deed, where comfort is valued more than feat, where privacy is valued more than publicity. But look at the people who today go as volunteers to the front. Look at those who go on polar expeditions from which half do not return. At those who launch into space knowing the catastrophe statistics. At doctors who walk into zones of epidemic. At firefighters who walk into a building they do not walk out of. In each of these people, there is a fraction of the same choice that Achilles made beneath Troy. A short life with meaning instead of a long one without it. The Greeks formulated this 3,000 years ago. All of humanity that has lived after them has only been rewriting it in different words. And now, about the detail with which we began this story. Today, on the coast of modern Turkey, in the provincial village of Hisarlik, archaeologists are at work. The layer of earth that dates to the 12th century before our era, the same layer in which Mycenaean Troy stood, has preserved broken bronze spear points. One of those points could have belonged to a warrior of that war, the memory of which became the foundation of the legend of Achilles. Another, to the one who fell by his hand beneath the walls of that city. A third, to the one who was let out of the walls by order of the gods. We will never know for certain, but the points themselves lie in the earth, real, bronze, covered with traces of oxidation. 32 centuries have passed over this layer of earth, and the name of the man who chose to die young so that they would speak of him is still being spoken. The Greeks called this immortality. Perhaps they were not mistaken.